the Eagle Leadership Award. Ricardo Lara serves as California's Insurance Commissioner, a statewide elected position he won in 2020 after serving in both the California Assembly and Senate for 8 years. Raised by a factory worker and a seamstress, Ricardo is the first openly gay person to be elected to statewide office in California's history. As insurance commissioner, Ricardo has taken on tough fights and won for California consumers and the Latino community. He is a proud graduate of San Diego State University and, as I mentioned earlier, currently serves as the president of NALEO. Please welcome our friend, the Honorable Ricardo Lara, for the introduction of our keynote speaker and honoree.
For over 3 decades, Dr. De La Torre has served institutions of higher learning, driven by her unwavering commitment to education, family, and hard work. These core values are rooted in her history, that she will share in a bit. Dr. De La Torre grew up in a diverse working class neighborhood with a single mom, and she's never lost sight of those humble beginnings even now, as she leads 35,000 students, 3,000 faculty and staff, and nearly a $1 billion annual budget. SDU has changed my life, and through Dr. De La Torre's leadership, I know for certain the university is changing the lives of so many others. It's wonderful to join every one of you here today and to congratulate our Madam Presidenta. Madam President De La Torre, congratulations. Let's give her a round of applause.
Mil gracias, Ricardo, Mickey, Lydia, to be in the room with you is fantastic. Everybody here today, I can't tell you how grateful I am. You know, I have to start with a funny story. You know, when I went through the convocation, my mom was about 95 at the time, and she couldn't come. So she had, my niece was there helping her with the Facebook Live feed, which was really a big deal for my mom. And my mom looked at it and she said, you know, just remember to bring, because they had also all these wonderful decorations. She needed all the decorations. And I said to her, Mom, okay, which ones do you want? Everything. And because my mom was the type of mom, and she would literally do this. Well, do you know who my daughter is? And see, she needed to do that. So she was, you know, that's what it's about. It's about making our moms proud, right? When you think about it, it means so much. So I want to just start today and thank, of course, everybody here, but I also want to thank a moment. So my mom passed away about a year ago, and I need to thank her. And my sister passed away also about a year ago from, she had ovarian cancer. It was undetected, and it happened very quickly. And I always say, because my sister and my mom were like two peas in a pod, I said, you know, my sister passed away first, and I just knew in my heart and hearts, I wanted my mom to get to 100. You know, that was a big, big year. But I knew that the minute I told her, and I was really, really torn, but you know, you can't lie to your mom. You just cannot. And I told her, and I just knew at that moment, I could see it in her eyes, that she wouldn't last long. And I'm grateful that I know that they're looking at me right now, and I know they're rooting for me, and they're here with me. So I'm just so pleased to honor them and to start a little bit about my story. And you know, it was funny, I was thinking, so what am I going to say? And I just decided I'm going to tell my story, because I think who I am is so much, when I look at my life and I talk to my students, it reflects so much of who they are. So when I look at my really early formative years and I look at the factors that have made me a president, they really come from my childhood. And it occurred with my mom as a single parent and my abuelita. And really what was important is they instilled, I think, the very important values that pushed me forward. So we didn't have a lot of funds financially, but I never felt I lacked anything because my abuelita was an absolute genius. In fact, long before people knew what recycling was, my grandmother was the expert with latas and with jars. In fact, I used to think, because she would use all of the different tin cans, she would take every seed, every seedling. Our backyard was full of latas, geraniums, plants, flowers. And I really thought that was the only way you could grow a plant, is you had to recycle your tin cans. So I really thought at the time, when I looked at my grandma's macetas, that she was a genius. Because she did teach me everything that I could imagine. In fact, even with a dress, because back then also, everything had value. She said, Adelita, todo puedes usar. I said, okay, Grandma, what am I going to do? You see this old dress, don't throw it away. 2 delantales. Or a washcloth, or better yet, you can make it into another dress. The other thing I also learned from her was arroz. Arroz is very important in Mexican culture. It's very important in Latin America. In fact, it's important all over the world. So we would always have arroz. You know, we'd always have frijoles, we'd always have tortillas, we'd have a lot of other things too. But whenever we had arroz left over, she'd say, okay, mañana, arroz enfermo. And she did it perfectly. Just amount of sweetness and a little bit of canela. And in the morning, it was absolutely fabulous. But probably my favorite thing about my grandmother is what she could do with harina, with flour. So she would make all of our tortillas, and she would put them on the comal. And she also taught me, I learned how to make tortillas, and I also learned how to smother it with butter, with mantequilla. That is the only way to have tortillas. You have to have mantequilla. If she made her bolillos, which were the best, right out of the horno, yes, you had to put plenty of mantequilla. So I have to say it was her imagination, her talent, and her creativity that taught me that a lack of dollars doesn't mean you don't have a vision. Indeed, it can expand your imagination in ways you could possibly not imagine. Now, my mother, Herminia, was the youngest of her 3 children, and she had a lot of early emotional pain and hardship. Early on, her father died when she was very, very young, Juan Francisco. And what happened was she needed to work early. So my mother grew up in the Central Valley. My grandparents were from Mexico. And so she worked with her sister, my Uncle Paco, and they worked together to support the family. But she said to me all the time that it was worth working to accomplish something. And she struggled to finish her education. She became a teacher, but it took her a long time. And it was always a sense of, I could have done a better job, right? But when I think about graduating from Modesto Community College in the 1940s as a young Mexican-American woman, and yes, transferring to Berkeley and living with my grandmother's comadre at the time, who lived in El Cerrito, it was a very different place. And she was able to graduate from Berkeley in the 40s, which is pretty remarkable. So her college degree, and this is what's key, opened the door for her future. She became an elementary school teacher, and she taught for 40 years. And I always remember my mom's story because she went back to the Central Valley when she got her degree. She didn't have a credential, but she had an emergency credential, and she immediately went to teach in a school in the Valley. And what happened was she went to the classroom, and they put her with mostly Mexican kids. And, of course, she could speak Spanish. And at the time, the principal was this white, older woman. And she looked at my mother, because my mother was spending a lot of times with the kids. And she said to her, why are you wasting that time with those kids? And she said, well, what would have happened to me if a teacher didn't spend time with me? And she said, well, you're different. And she said, I'm not different. They're me. And she said it with such grace, but conviction. She wanted me to know at an early age that this type of experience would be part of my life, that those perceptions of me and accomplishments would be critical, but I needed to be strong and be ready to battle. So in this context, my mom was an amazingly courageous woman. She was an amazingly gentle and compassionate woman, and she supported my mother, my grandmother, my sister, and me so we could move forward without fear. And I say fear because she also suffered tremendously, not only by losing her father, but also because she was in a horribly abusive, physically and emotional relationship. And she almost died in childbirth. In fact, I was her last child, and she almost died. And in that pregnancy, she had to really make a decision to protect all of us. So she gave me to my grandmother to raise. And for the first 5-6 years, I did not know my mother was my mother. I thought she was a lady that lived upstairs. And I used to call my mother, my abuela, mi mamá. I go, mi mamá, ¿qué vamos a hacer? Mi mamá, ¿qué vamos a hacer? And so for many, many years, my sister and I, we were inseparable with my grandmother because my mother could not psychologically handle taking care of us. So early on, we had this amazing relationship with my grandmother. My grandmother was never a citizen. She was a Mexican immigrant. She wanted to be a citizen, but she had to raise her grandkids. She had to work. She worked in San Francisco making flowers. She worked making blinds. She basically worked wherever she could get a little bit of money to help. She also only spoke Spanish, so my first language was Spanish, and so it was our home language. But when I talk about that, I see it in a very different way. We had this incredibly open house. We had our primos, we had our tios, we had family from Mexico, we had neighbors coming in. And so what happened is our language, Spanish, brought us all together. It was a language of love. It was a language of connection. And so nuestra casa was a casa of love. And I did have an important male figure in my life, and that was my Uncle Paco. So my Uncle Paco fought in World War II. But he would come every weekend, and he was also my padrino. And he always would spoil me. But what I really remember and I loved is I would sit in the kitchen table. And you know, in Mexican families, kitchen tables are very, very important. And he would get, I'd have my leche, always caliente, because you have to have warm milk, especially when you have bolillos. And he would put a little bit of café y mucho azúcar. So I started drinking coffee, and to this day I drink a lot of coffee because of my uncle, my tío Paco. And it was interesting because my grandmother would look aside, because she didn't quite approve, but she would say to me, Adelita es un buen hombre. And one of the things when you say es un buen hombre, it has a real important meaning in our culture. Un buen hombre takes care of their family. And she would always tell me, ese es un buen hombre, cuidado con ese. And so I would begin to understand, as you know, con los indirectas, because, you know, things aren't necessarily direct. You get these indirect things, right? You learn to translate. So I always had this wonderful sense of family. But more importantly, I also had this extended family. So, of course, my grandmother's sisters would come, Mama Tita, and Mama Tita was actually my first teacher. Mama Tita would listen to me speak Spanish, and then she'd say, Adelita, ¿qué dijiste? And I said, you know, I always was very respectful. And then she said, you didn't use the subjunctive right. And I would go, oh my gosh, you know. But she was my first teacher. Then I had my Aunt Tana who would come, who is my mom's sister, and she would come in and she would say to me, Adelita, con boca cerrada, because you can't eat with your mouth open, right? But she said, con boca cerrada no entran moscas. So I constantly had people educating me so that I had this village. And it was a village. It was my world. It became one of the factors that I think defined how I wanted to be part of a world where it wasn't separated by a small group, but in bringing everybody together. And so it was the love, the generosity, the humor that allowed me to believe in myself in ways. The last thing that I was raised devoutly Catholic. So my abuelita was devout. The Virgen de Guadalupe, the Virgen de Fatima, San Judas, right? So much that my grandmother insisted that my sister and I, after every rosary, and sometimes we would do it, it would go a week, no rosary, then it'd be every single day, right? So, but there was one prayer that I remember every time in the rosary that we had to pray. And some of you probably know this, some of you may not. Dulce Madre, no me alejes. Tu vista no, de mí no hay partes. Ven conmigo todas partes y solo nunca me dejes, right? And I remember that because it was a prayer that I still, every day in my heart, I have it. But I have it in my heart for another reason. Interestingly enough, so when I mentioned my sister passed away, and it was really sudden. So I was fortunate that the hospital allowed me to stay with her and be with her. And at that moment, I started praying this prayer. She was, in pain. She was sleeping, and I didn't think she heard me. But I'll tell you something a little bit funny, even though this was a tragic event. So I didn't say the prayer right. My sister was a Spanish teacher for over 30 years. So she said, I said, no me alejas. And she's, no, subjunctive. And I thought to myself, oh my God, Judy, even in death, you're going to do this to me. And I had to say, that's my family. They're always there watching out for me, right? And so when I look about how I am today, I must look back at when I was a 5-year-old girl, growing up in the Bay Area, con mi abuelita, con mi mamá, with my sister, con mis tíos, mis primos, everybody, right? And it was through a collective effort, I have to say, that I got the best of our culture. And they raised a fatherless little girl so that she could become the woman you see here today before you. And so I just want to mention that because I think that history is a history that many in our community share. And I think it's a pathway that gives us much hope. So now, as university president, I want to give you some advice of how I think certain lessons learned helped me get there. And I have to make one comment because when I became president of San Diego State University, I remember driving in, and I just got off the freeway there, and you see the sign, and you see the magnitude of the institution. I remember telling my husband, Steve, I said, I don't believe this. I'm president. I'm president of this institution. And I just thought to myself, well, I'm just going to have to do it well, right? You're going to, con ganas. And I just said, but even after 3 years, I still am in awe of being a university president. I am humbled and I am grateful. And I have to say, when I look around the room and I see all the Aztecs here, and there are a lot, and I can't go into a single room in San Diego and not find an Aztec, I feel that I'm privileged to lead this great institution. But again, going back to what are the things or lessons learned for a pathway for a presidency, I think there's important ones. And I want to start with a couple of, I guess, concepts or areas that I think are important. First and foremost, and I think, Ricardo, you exemplify this, embrace who you are and your passions. I live in a period of California history when discrimination against Mexican Americans and language discrimination was very, very real. And I saw it, I felt it, and I knew it. Nonetheless, I would have to say my abuelita instilled in me a sense of pride about my Mexicanidad, and that I needed to recognize that would be a resilient feature, my culture and my language. So I didn't forget the sting when I felt it, but I never let it diminish my pride. As regards to my personal passion early on, it was education. I loved to learn, and interestingly enough, in high school, I loved mathematics. And it wasn't because my mother or my grandmother, because neither of them, that wasn't their strength, or either my tios or anyone else. But I remember, particularly my sophomore year, I really fell in love with geometry. And I somewhat attribute that to the fact that my grandmother taught me to sew, to embroider, to do everything with my hands, with the idea that it doesn't matter if you have a piece of thread, if you have imagination, you can create anything. And that's what mathematics did. You know, it was a formula, but you could create magic. So after high school, I was fortunate to go to UC Berkeley. And like many, I worked throughout college. And I began to take higher level courses. But the funny thing here again, and this goes to the second important message, is that you have to be able to take risks, right? The risk I took, so Ricardo, similar to you, I started school, but I didn't have any guidance. I just kind of started. I decided I wanted to take calculus, but I had no preparation. I mean, I really did not have any preparation. But I said, I want to take it. It sounds interesting. I think I might be able to do this, right? I struggled. It probably was the biggest mistake because I wasn't prepared, but I remember I got a B-. And that B- was one of my favorite grades. I was like, oh my God, I can do this. I'm a woman, I can do this, right? And it's interesting because you've heard the story about, the students get A's and then the students get B's and C's. Who's the leader, right? It's oftentimes those students that take the risk and aren't getting the A's that end up being in leadership roles because they take the risk. And then listen to the consejos and advice. And some of that advice is not going to be necessarily from a friend or a colleague or a family member. And that advice really is true for me because of why I pursued advanced education. I never thought I'd get a master's degree or a doctoral degree. That was not on my radar. I was walking on campus, a professor took me aside, and I just said, well, what are you doing here? Because I had taken his class. I said, oh, I don't know, I'm going to be graduating, I'm thinking of what I'm going to do. And he said, well, Adela, you're not bad in economics. Have you thought about getting a master's in agricultural economics? And I said, no. But it occurred to me just by that one comment that I should apply. And I applied to 3 graduate schools, Berkeley, I applied to Davis, and I applied to Oregon State. And I got into all 3, and the rest is history. I fell in love with economics, and I moved on. But that is an example. Advice comes in strange forms, and if you have the opportunity to take them. The next one, I would say, is embrace the challenges set before you with hard work, but con ganas. You've got to do things con ganas, otherwise it doesn't work. So I struggled, believe me, with my doctoral training. In fact, I remember I would call my grandmother, okay, tienes que poner la vela para San Judas. I have an exam. I would pray to the Virgencita because I had to pray to the Virgencita before I did the exam. And so there was this whole ritual. But at the end of the day, I knew I had worked my tail off, right? And I walked in with a sense of, I'm going to just do it. I'm going to put everything on the line. And I know there are people who thought, her math skills aren't good enough, she's not smart enough, she's not going to make it. And I really knocked it out of the park. I ended up doing very well. But I didn't have the confidence, but I had the ganas. The other thing is important is career planning. And a lot of people ask me, okay, what are the career plans to become a president? And I always tell them, most great outcomes oftentimes don't happen with a career plan. It's from unplanned events. And I always tell them, if you look at my resume very closely, you will see me zigzagging. I went from California to Colorado to Arizona to California. And the thing that really motivated me was my impact, my passion, and particularly my impact on students. So job security and salary was never a motivation for me. It was really that. And each time I looked for that challenge, it also came in an unexpected form. So it wasn't like, I was applying for a job. I usually had somebody knocking on my door. And then love what you do. Know your purpose. When I look at myself today, and I can honestly say that I've been blessed to be in higher education for 30 years. And unlike many presidents, most of my years have been in the classroom and as a researcher. And I just loved every moment of it. But what I have to say was one of my passions particularly, and I just knew it every time I was in the classroom, was working with students who were like me, who were traditionally underserved, and who really needed my voice, and sometimes, my loud voice, in order for them to move forward. But when I saw them successful, it was as if I had succeeded. It was me, and I felt an incredible psychic reward. So once I was a tenured professor, this is another piece of advice. I had people who saw raw talent. All of us have raw talent, but oftentimes it has to be seen by others. And they helped open doors for me and advise me. So I became a department chair, I became a head of a research center, I became a special assistant to the dean, I became a vice chancellor, and then I became a president. The other piece is create a community. So when you're the one and only, and so Nora, you're the one and only, you're a trailblazer, and yet you're still alone, right? Ricardo, you're a trailblazer, but you're still alone. So you need to find gente and folks. You need to create that group, and I did that when I was in graduate school. So all the Latinas at Berkeley decided, we were the only ones in these doctoral programs, so we basically created a group of women called Mujeres en Marcha, and it was, for me, very important to have Latinas. And I realized because I was in a world of Latinas, I grew up with Latinas, my tias, my abuela, my mother, they were women who were always surrounding me, so I had to recreate that. And we did recreate it, and that was my cocoon. That was my support group. Those were my cheerleaders. They were my sorority sisters. And they were the ones that made a difference in many ways in helping me move on. And finally, and this is really core to who I am, is familia first and familia last. Throughout my career and throughout my life, central to who I am is my familia. And there has to be a balance between your professional career, your community activism, because without your familia close to your heart, then you really have no purpose, right? So remember, it can be broadly defined, but you need that emotional and spiritual support. And you need that because you need somewhere where you can have your confianzas, your love, your pain, your anger, whatever feeling or aspirations you have. So in my case, I've been blessed. I have the love of my life, my husband, Steve. I have my two wonderful daughters, Adelita and Gabriela, my nietos. I have Javier, Cecilia Luz, and a new granddaughter on the way. So they nurture and support me every day. And they also tell me when I should stop talking. When I started to talk today, and I'm almost done, I started with my journey to the presidency with my childhood memories of mi familia. And I want to end this talk with honoring my family today. So it's in the deep roots of my familia, which are embedded in our Latino culture, that will always, always propel us to succeed as individuals and as a community. So like this pearl necklace, this is my mom's. And I wear it today because each pearl is a pearl of wisdom. But if you know pearl necklaces, they're knotted by hand, right? At least the old-fashioned ones are. And I would say that each of these knots are knots of love. And it's really the type of love that we experience that propels us forward. So I want to end with this little story about my grandmother, because I used to like to have pláticas with my abuela, and she always wanted to give me advice. But there was one that I wanted to, when we had a plática, and I always used to do this at the end of a plática with her. I'd always say, "Abuelita, ¿me quieres?" Well, I knew the answer, right? Of course she loved me. I was her granddaughter. But I just loved the way she would respond to me, and it always was the same response. And she'd always say, "Ay, Adelita, ¿cómo te quiero?" And she'd always emphasize how I love you, how I love you. You see, to be a leader, you must love and know love. But it is how you love that will make the difference. Mil gracias.
Thank you. I'm going to grab one.
Yes.
Dr. Adela de la Torre, on behalf of the Latino Leaders Network, it is my honor to present you with our Eagle Leadership Award for your contribution to our community, your outstanding commitment to your community. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much.
We'll take this over.